Good evening. I'm Laurie Tisch, and president and founder of the Laurie Tisch Illumination Fund. And along with my brothers, Steve and John, we're so happy to have started work with the Aspen Institute to present this program, Conversations with Great Leaders, in honor of Preston Robert Tisch, our father. And tonight, I'm sure you all agree, from the sold-out house, that we have amongst the best leaders. Many of you have been here before, and you know that I don't always do the introductions. As a matter of fact, I made what I now see as a big mistake of having my daughters do two of them. Needless to say, they were really good, flawless. So I hope that's okay. That's the last time I'm going to have that. Yeah, exactly. Lesson learned. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to Roosevelt House, which is the Public Policy Institute of Hunter College, the historic home of Sarah and Franklin Eleanor Roosevelt. And the Roosevelt House is the Institute's home of New York City, and many of our programs at the Institute are held here, and it's a great partnership that we have with President Jennifer Rabb. Oops, I forgot to say, I didn't finish my sentence, that the reason I'm doing, one of the reasons that I'm doing the introduction tonight is because not only do I have the honor of introducing this really tremendous panel, and I'm sure you know many of their accolades, awards, qualifications, but on a personal note, Walter and Andy are also very, very good and longtime friends of mine. I first met Andy 30 years ago when I was starting the Children's Museum of Manhattan, and Andy was one of our board members. As you can imagine, he was not big on the blah, blah, blah. He cut right to the chase. I think it was always about the birthday parties that was, and even though I don't generally remember very much, as a matter of fact, at lunch today, Rick said he was having a senior moment. I said he's so lucky because I usually have senior seconds. But with Andy, I do remember so much of what you told us and how you were such a great leader and board member. And I'm not sure if anybody told you tonight, but we're building a new children's museum. This is just about to be announced. And they offered you up as a board member, so thank you.
All righty.
Talk about leadership. Come on, we get Andy Lack back 30 years later. So this series began. Oh, and Walter. Walter, I've also known for quite a while. I have really the great fortune and honor to serve on the board of the Aspen Institute, and there's so much to say about Walter, but he really, talk about great leaders. Walter is beloved. Brilliant, visionary, and we wish him much good luck in his new roles. Walter doesn't just take on one role in his new roles, but he will be missed, and always invited back here to Hunter, and I'm sure everywhere else. So this series began in memory of my father, Preston Robert Tisch, in 2009, and has featured leaders who are making differences in their community by the way they look at their role in helping to build a civil society. And no matter which side of the aisle you're on, I think everybody would agree that now more than ever, we need to talk about building a civil society. These leaders, over the past, how many years? 8 years, represent the values and commitment to public good that reflects the belief and the work of the man being honored by this series, my father, Preston Robert Tisch. So as you will hear, tonight is very much about civil society and the role played by media in keeping citizens informed about issues that affect their well-being and the health of a democracy. So my friend Andy Lack, my new board member Andy Lack, is everything. Didn't someone say everything new is old again, or everything old is new again, or something? Andrew Lack is the chairman of NBC News and MSNBC. He oversees editorial and business operations for the award-winning television and digital news properties at both networks. He has also served as chairman of Bloomberg Media, as well as chairman and CEO of Sony Music Entertainment. Much of his early television career was spent at 60 Minutes, where he was the producer for was at CBS, where he was the producer for 60 Minutes and senior executive producer of CBS Reports. Rebecca Blumenstein, my new friend, was named deputy managing editor of the New York Times in February 2017. Previously, she was deputy editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, where she held a number of positions, including managing editor of the Journal Online and China bureau chief, overseeing China coverage for the Journal. And our moderator, Walter, Rick and I were at a lunch today with with Jason, who works with Jason Mangone, who works with Stan. Yeah. And he was telling us that he's leaving his job to write a book with Stan McChrystal. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, why do you have to leave your job? Why don't you just write from 12 to 5 like Walter does? He thought that was great for Walter. So Walter is president and CEO of the Aspen Institute and has been chairman and CEO of CNN and the editor of Time magazine. Also the author of many books, including Steve Jobs, Einstein, His Life and Universe, and most recently, The Innovators, How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution. So I will now turn it over to the panel and stop talking for 2 reasons. Number one, because they have so much to say, and number two, because somebody in the audience just told me that we need to go quickly because she needs to get home to watch Einstein tonight.
I'll tell you how it ends. Yes, thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Rick. It's really great. Thanks for what you do and all you've done. And I'll add one more thing to Rebecca's biography, which was a Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute, which is why you've moved to success, to significance. And congratulations on your new job.
Thank you very much.
And I'll start with you because the media really under fire, both financially and now politically.
That's right.
And yet both of you are at organizations that seem to be thriving in the current climate, the New York Times and NBC. So what is it you're doing that helps you thrive in this very difficult period, both financially and in dealing with the politics?
I mean, I think that part of it is that in the wake of an election that, quite frankly, has changed everything. It's a gigantic business story. It's a gigantic global diplomacy story. It's a gigantic political story, of course. I think people realized that as much talk as there has been of fake news, that they needed to, that actually facts matter, that truth matters. And finally, this moment has come that we in journalism have been hoping would happen for a long time, that people have realized, you know what, I might need to pay for this. Mm-hmm. And I might need to play an active role in the information that I'm consuming. The Times added 300,000 subscribers in the first quarter.
Digital too.
Digital too, mostly digital. Mm-hmm. And that, similarly in the fourth quarter of last year, added more than the entire 2012 and 2013 combined. And
bravo.
And I would say that, the Wall Street Journal, a place where I worked for many years, was a pioneer in pay. The Times followed, but there has always been this reluctance, in a way, for people to part with their money. They were like, "Why should we pay for journalism when we can just get it for free?" And I think that one of the good things that has happened here is that. Recognizing that there was a lot of false information out there during the election, that people want trusted news sources to go to. We have a huge obligation as news sources to try to get things right, to try to be fair, to try to recognize parts of the story that, quite frankly, we probably didn't recognize adequately enough, leading up to this moment. But that that this is journalism worth paying for, and that and I think.
And why can't it just be ad supported? What's wrong with that model?
The thing that happened. Well, first of all, obviously we're in the middle of a tremendous transition to digital, and if you all look at the way you consume news, and I spoke to someone very smart in this. A couple years ago, who said, just do a personal inventory, Rebecca, of what do you do? Are you reading that paper, or are you looking at it on your phone? Are you finishing the story? How what's grabbing your attention? And we are in the midst of a huge transition to mobile and to digital. Print is still very important, and I personally love a print paper. But digital advertising is nowhere nearly as lucrative as that full-page ad in a print newspaper. And what happened?
When do you survive without the print advertising at the New York Times?
What happened in the fourth quarter of last year is print advertising went over a ledge
Left.
for everybody. And so you not only have the pressure of covering Trump, you have great financial pressure. And the fact is that Google and Facebook, as much as we were hoping that digital advertising would be the answer, it's not as lucrative in digital. And Facebook and Google account for 85% of the growth in digital advertising.
In other words, they basically taking 85 cents of the dollar
That's right.
on the journalism that others create.
That's exactly right, and that's a whole important topic that that needs to be discussed, because they're not compensating. They're not. I have a mortgage, I have a family. Journalists need to make a living, and Facebook and Google and a lot of the purveyors of online content are not paying for it. So this, we hope that we don't get to answer your question. We hope that print is going to be around for a very long time, but there's no question that we have to prepare ourselves for a world in which print, and particularly print advertising, is not going to play nearly the role that it used to. And that's a much more uncertain world, even for the digital subscriptions at the Times are helping a lot, but they don't make up for the declines in traditional print advertising.
So what are you all doing digitally at NBC, MSNBC, Comcast, NBC?
Well, I embrace a lot of what Rebecca just spoke about in terms of the importance of mobile and digital. So that's the future for all of us. The platforms that are developing digitally are collecting the biggest audiences I've seen in my lifetime, multiplying against even the best years,
Like what?
often in television. Well, you're looking at a platform with Facebook, for example, where they've got a reach of billions, and I expect over time, though I don't love their business model as it relates to content creators, but over time, we'll figure out a business model for that. There isn't one right now, no joy in saying that, but there is just not a digital business model that I can see, and I've been banging away at it. Walter was the original at Time beginning to bang away at it back in the early 90s. We created MSNBC essentially because we needed a subscription business, which cable provided. We knew as a single broadcast advertiser needy one platform piece of a business model. It was the business model. It was the only revenue that we would get.
Real
for our
quickly,
content.
as the
And cable was offering, with subscribers and ad revenue, the dual revenue stream that broadcasters didn't have. And ABC got lucky with ESPN. They would say it was luck. They didn't really, when they bought ESPN, think they were buying what became a behemoth in cable. And we made a bet on MSNBC. We went looking for a partner. Bill Gates was the MS in MSNBC. Most people don't know that anymore because they exited 4 or 5 years ago. But
why'd you do it with Microsoft? You, Brokaw, and Bill Gates hammered it out.
We did for the same reasons we're talking about digital now. They were the future. They were then the Google and Amazon combined. There was no other player really that had the weight that Microsoft had in those days. And they had the deep pockets. They had the money. We effectively sold half of NBC News to them. We didn't put it that way back in 1996. But that, in fact, is what happened. And it was around, I mean, the price they paid for public consumption was $450 million, I think, something like that, for essentially the value of the retransmission consent that we got from having a cable channel. But the reality was they paid us in license fees over the next 15 years $1 billion+. It floated NBC News. That is the engine, the financial engine, the underpinning of what NBC News has helped make NBC News financially healthy all these years, and in this year, as healthy as we've ever been.
Because MS is doing so well.
Because MS is doing so well. Now, that said, on the broadcast platform, and it's important to point this out, and I feel in some ways that I don't want to live in a world without the New York Times, and I feel in some ways the Times is hanging in there against all odds on some level because the journalism is so strong, and it holds a unique niche because of the quality of its work. and because its competitors are slipping, and a lot of the great metropolitan dailies are effectively gone. All that said, for NBC News, I remember our friend Ken Oletta wrote in a book called Three Blind Mice that NBC, which had a scandal, which is the reason I got lucky and got a job there back in the early 90s. They were searching for someone to help fix the place, and magazine journalism at the time was doing quite well, and Dateline had this scandal. It blew a truck up, and the building was shaking, and the view was that NBC News was going to go out of business. Well, here we are 20 plus years later, and the broadcast side has never been healthier. We don't get quite as much money as we used to, like the New York Times, but this upfront, the ad market right now that's going on in New York, a historic moment for television every year, is very healthy. And the digital piece of it, not so much. It's okay.
Why is that? People would rather a broadcast ad?
Because of what Rebecca touched on. For us, it's not healthy because the publishers aren't willing to pay us for our content, and advertisers are uncertain about the climate in which they're placing that advertising. They're willing to make billions of dollars worth of bets on digital, and the 15% of us are dividing up that pot. The 85% that's going to Facebook and to Google, who pays us precious little, is where the business model falls apart. That's what collapses the underpinnings of a.
Well, let me ask
model.
both of you real quickly. How do you get out from under Google and Facebook?
Well, I think I think
And
we got to.
YouTube and others.
Yeah, I think we have to fight much harder and be more disciplined about what that fight involves. And our content, which is precious to us, we have been giving away in some form or fashion without, I believe, the confidence and belief in what the requirements are of holding on to that content and the business model that should exist around it with a lot more aggressiveness.
And Rebecca, you all in some ways just sold out to Facebook for a while and then had second thoughts, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, Facebook comes around and, they now have a new journalism project where they're, post-election trying to, recognize the value of journalism and work more collaboratively with news organizations. So they've done, Facebook Live, Facebook Video. They will try to push you to give all your content in a certain area to Facebook for really not a huge sum of money, to be honest. Yeah. And so the Times has, right, I mean.
And you don't own the subscriber.
And then you don't own the subscribers. And then the rules change. I mean, everybody works with Facebook. They got it figured out, and then they change the algorithm. So it's really hard for news organizations. They've kind of got a plan. They've got something figured, and then it changes. I think that what's really interesting and worth keeping an eye on is what's happening with advertisers in Facebook and Google over objectionable videos. There's been the cases in the UK where advertisers have realized, oh my gosh, my Tide ended up next to an ISIS video, and Procter & Gamble does not want to be near, content that is on YouTube or anywhere else that's objectionable. And there is still something about having a trusted news organization, and it turns out that digital advertising is full of, it seems very transparent, it seems measurable, but it's really not. There's all sorts of ways to game it. And advertisers really have very little control over where their brands are going.
Could you take your content off of Facebook?
Could the Times take our content off of Facebook? Well, that would be interesting. I think that the Times, in many ways, wants, of course, people to come to the Times and not to Facebook. We want big audiences for our stories. I would say the traffic. Some of the big stories at the Times are getting 2 and 3 million hits a day. I mean, those are huge
What
numbers.
percentage of those hits comes from Google and Facebook, and which come from people who go to the New York Times?
A huge percentage. The homepage of the Times is driving a lot of traffic. The mobile of the Times is driving a ton of traffic. And it depends on the story. There are some. I think it's almost more relevant if there's like kind of the the story that you didn't expect was going to succeed, that people are finding on Facebook or Google, that gets a life of its own. But for the big, political stories, the big scoops, the things that we send news alerts out about, people are coming to the Times.
Directly to them.
So could we live without Facebook and Google? Perhaps. The Wall Street Journal is pushing it with Google. They eliminated one-click free, and their traffic from Google has dropped considerably. And that is a really tough choice that news organizations have to make right now. Do we trade, and the journal subscriptions have also gone up, but do we trade, a smaller audience for, to kind of stand up to Facebook and Google? And it's just hard given their reach, as you described, for any news organization. And quite honestly, the New York Times wants to be viewed around the world.
Sure.
And digitally,
I
Facebook and
remember
Google are
Time
part of that.
magazine when we tried to put up a paywall. All of a sudden, it's like when Tom Friedman was
Yeah.
behind a paywall, he was about to quit. 'Cause
Right.
Enough about the fun of business. Let's get to the joy of politics. You said a moment ago what we forgot to tell you leading into the election, what we didn't cover well. And you're off the hook because you weren't actually at the New York. You're
Yeah.
still at the Wall Street Journal. But if I may say, the New York Times has been amazing in the past couple of months, playing volleyball with the Washington Post in stories. But the New York Times totally missed it last year, what happened in America. I'm going to ask both of you, why do we miss that?
I think
What went wrong? And
part of it is, and I was at the Journal at the time, and I would argue that the Journal came closer to it. I think I am originally from Michigan, the middle of the country is something that we're talking about a lot more. I think that for those of us, and I count myself included, who live on the coast and kind of fly back and forth a lot, we mistook a bit of our optimism about the future for that of the rest of the country. I think if you look at the Pew studies, there was just one out about people's fundamental belief: are your kids going to be better off than you? It has really been eroding in America, and it's been particularly eroding in parts of the country where jobs have been lost to China, and the future is even more uncertain, especially with manufacturing. So the Journal did a series of stories, like looking at, they actually tracked communities where factories had closed and found that 89% of those, and sent jobs to China, 89% of those had voted for Trump. I would say that there was such a euphoria, and this happened at the Times and within the Clinton campaign, of data, and data is going to be the future. And data tells us that there's no way that she can't win. And I think that news organizations, including the Journal and the Times, have been very chastened by the fact of how surprised they were. People told pollsters one thing, they went in and did something else. But I think fundamentally we need to change the way that we cover this country, because it looks very different in Ohio and Alabama and Michigan than it does from here. And I think that was the seminal error that that we're still
Andy,
working
I
on.
would say that you all got it right better than most people at NBC. I remember a particular week I was with you down south, and you were more open to Trump. You kind of had the feel for what was going to happen. Matt, Lau, others covered it well. And I think NBC was the exception. It's like you did not dismiss it.
Walter.
But now Trump is dumping all over you and has turned NBC into the enemy.
Yeah.
What's it like trying to deal with this phenomenon when you're just trying to cover it right?
Well, we're not the opposition party or the enemy of
The people?
the people. And we've heard that hymn before. We've seen that playbook before. And it doesn't intimidate the press, or certainly those of us who take this work as seriously as we do. I don't know why he's obsessed with the media. I think he actually loves the media in his own inimitable way.
That's right.
I was talking about this earlier. We were talking Roy Bostock and I, about he didn't do what he said he was going to do during the campaign. He was going to make a move to be, quote unquote, more presidential, and that's exactly the way he put it. He knew he was disrupting and saying crazy things for all intents and purposes in a campaign where we were not used to candidates talking the way he did. I think what we didn't underestimate that. And I do think we didn't have good state polls, so we didn't have a good grip on what actually played out in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania the way it did. We're a company owned by a large company in Philadelphia, and they didn't know what was going on in the Philadelphia suburbs as well as you would have thought all of us would have understood. But that said, I think a couple of things happened, if I can add to what Rebecca was saying. I think one, particularly in this town, underestimated how Hillary Clinton did not represent any change at all for a large segment of the population outside of this state. Two, that she was very unlikable as a candidate, and that hurt in ways that were hard to calibrate, particularly if you were flying over most of the country. I hang out a lot in the South, as Walter was saying. I got family roots down there. There are no lawn signs for large swatches of America for Hillary Clinton as you went around this country, just absent. So to be fair to her, the desire for real change from Washington, which I think any candidate would have encountered representing the Democrats, was huge and not calculated, I think, properly by us. Right. I think another piece of it is that she then particularly became a candidate that was not well-liked or acceptable. And then she has said herself that her message she had difficulty honing her message for a large part of the campaign. By the time she may have, depending on your view of how it played out, the country, a lot of people in the country had made their call, made their decision. And then, of course, we underestimated the implosion in the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party as it related to the competition on those stages. Bernie Sanders hurt Hillary. Yeah. Just, again, in incalculable ways that we didn't really report. Again, on television, Bernie would come on, particularly MSNBC, and we felt it. We could feel it. And we could feel the millions of people in the Democratic Party who were just not going to go to Hillary. So that was another reason why NBC, I think, was a little bit closer in touch with the campaign. And then lastly, I just think that the desire, as Rebecca said, I would put it slightly differently, for an optimistic future. Having a woman as president was part of that vision. People thought, particularly as it related to the Donald Trump that they saw up there, the choice was clear. And again, it was not calculated what most Americans were really thinking about the choice they had in front of them. And it just didn't involve a lot of those kinds of considerations.
I think also, to give Trump credit, he spoke brilliantly to not only workers, but to many people in this country who feel that politicians just have stopped representing them, and have been the case for a long time. And it kind of has gotten to the point where people were like, well, just blow it up. It doesn't work, it doesn't serve me. And he really, when you look back at it, I think was one of the only candidates who promised real change to those people. And you look at a lot of members of the UAW in Detroit voted for Trump. And how is that possible? Right. Obama bailed out the auto industry. There would not be a General Motors if it wasn't for Obama. And yet the Democrats lost Michigan. And that's like a stunning, it's really kind of a stunning indictment, but his genius, I think, was establishing connections with the coal miners, with those workers that were very resonant, and I think more so than any people realized.
The data point, which was often spoken about, but again, I think all of us just didn't give it the weight it deserved, was that the median income for middle-class America didn't change from 1973, effectively 1974, 75, to 2017. It
and
was
not only that,
essentially a flat line through the heartland of the country.
And the insecurity, because at least people had stable jobs back then, even if income, and now
exactly,
you can't.
Which made it
have the
exponentially
normal,
worse.
You have, Andy, the least opinionated, most straightforward anchor there is, Lester Holt.
Yeah.
And you have one of the most opinionated there is,
Yeah.
Rachel Maddow.
Yeah.
how do you juggle caliber? I mean, you sit there and
They
you're
like
all-
each other, they're
I
friends.
don't know, I'm not worried about them personally as much as, how do you decide, okay, here's what we're gonna do here, here's what we're gonna do there, here, do you offer political
Well,
thinking to
you know,
them, or
just-
do they just go off and do it on their own?
The fact is, the platforms, like a lot of the digital platforms we talk about, are different. There are differences. The broadcast platform has triple to quadruple on its worst nights. 4x more people watching than are watching the cable networks. And particularly from a business standpoint, in the demographic that drives the business behind both cable and broadcast in our world, which is ages 18 to 49 or 25 to 54. So on the broadcast platform, there's a vast audience that's not interested in politics that much. And essentially, MSNBC is a political news channel. It's the place for politics and has been in its branding for 15 years. That's its core competency. When there isn't a big political story, yes, we're covering lots of other bits and bobs and the audience goes down.
But do you consciously decide that MS should be a liberal alternative?
No, I talked a little bit about this at the Times today. Thank you very much. It does have an opinion section at night that is liberal and progressive. During the day, and where we have changed this dramatically in the last couple of years, it's breaking news all day long. It was punditry, essentially, 24 hours a day.
Why'd you make that change?
Well, the audience had collapsed, for one thing. It wasn't a tough business call. When I came in, I'm in near my congregation, Temple Emmanuel, is across the street. We didn't have a minion at for much of MSNBC. So it was not a pretty picture. So it wasn't a tough call. That said, as I started to say a little earlier, MSNBC was created to be a big part of the success of NBC News and vice versa. They were one news organization, one set of values. But, like the esteemed New York Times, we have an opinion section. And it's all columnists. It's not the opinion of NBC News, unlike newspapers. We have a different relationship with our FCC than the Sulzbergers have with their newspaper. They can do whatever they choose about that. But we are not an alternative, as I said today, ever, in my view, to the Fox News channel, for example. They're in a parallel universe. They get to be whoever they want to be. But I don't think that MSNBC can ever be reach a point where it almost did, where you didn't see it as a real news channel. Its opinion are based on facts, and I challenge them if you want to. Dismiss them if you want to, but we think they're a pretty good set of facts every night that they're basing their arguments on, whether it's Rachel Maddow or Chris Matthews or you name the player. And then at 11 o'clock at night, we have Brian Williams, who switches gears, and it's more analytical than it is pure commentary. But that's the model. I grew up, Walter said I grew up around the corner here. My hometown paper is the New York Times. I didn't see it as my friends in the South see it, as a communist rag. I think it's a pretty damn good newspaper. But there are lots of parts of the country that see just anything with the name New York on it as a place where essentially the headquarters of the Communist Party resides. And most journalists are card-carrying members. That's the fact outside of Manhattan.
Now, Rebecca, at the moment, the New York Times is really leading in some ways the opposition to Trump. But the same people who did it, is it Mike Schmidt, some of the others, were the same ones who had the bylines that took down Hillary Clinton. Do you try at the New York Times to say, without fear or favor, which is the old motto there, that you're not going to be partisan?
No, absolutely. I think that, look, you have a president who, has been tough on the Times too. The failing New York Times has been a subject of many tweets. But I completely agree with you. Like, we cannot fall into that trap and become the opposition newsletter. It's just, it's not our role. It never has been. It never should be. We were tough on Obama. We were tough on Hillary. And we're tough on Trump. That's the job of the press. And it's more
By the
important.
way, you were very tough on Hillary. You weren't there, so I can ask you this question. Is there some regret at the New York Times that they misplayed the email stories on Hillary?
I don't think so, actually. I think that look, I think there was certainly, everyone was paying very close attention to, to how tough the Times was going to be on Republicans and Democrats. So I think they went pretty hard at it. I mean, the WikiLeaks, the way that the press, including the Times, did kind of, I think, and Obama said, credulously took it all and kind of probably didn't ask enough questions of like, where's this coming from? Who is, what is the concerted campaign here? And certainly the Times has done a lot of work, on Comey and his role in the election, since. But, I think there may have been a bit of giddiness of just like, emails. They're good things to have, and really looking fundamentally at like, well, where did they come from? And Russia became much more of a story kind of post-election than, leading up to it. Mm-hmm. But I would also say that there's pride in in the investigative work that the Times has done. I have to say, coming in from the outside, I've never seen politics kind of done at this level. Mm-hmm. And there are enterprise meetings every day, about what's going on.
But one of the reasons you're coming to the Times is they do politics,
yes.
Like MSNBC, the place for politics. And they haven't been that good on technology and business.
Right.
You feel that, and are you going to change that?
I hope to, yes. No, that's why I came. The Times actually has a big investment in business coverage. They always have. They viewed it as very important, along with economic coverage. But I think over the years it had become not as relevant as it should be, a little bit more investigative and enterprise story driven. And the Times really, for its long-term survival, needs to be there's never been the business story is hugely important right now. We have a businessman in the White House. And as we saw with the election, not really covering economics and how people are doing on the ground and the daily decisions they make about health care and where they're going to work and their financial lives are really important. And the Times needs to be a must-read, not only for politics, but also for business, and the intersection of business and politics. Mm-hmm. I mean, CEOs are now playing an incredibly large role in the Trump administration. Some of them are working inside the Trump administration. Many of them are advising the Trump administration. I think he has at least three, maybe 4 or 5 CEO kind of councils, and he's using them. Some CEOs have dropped out, certainly. But this is really fascinating in terms of involving business and Obama. People accused him throughout his presidency of not really caring about business. And I think one could say that maybe corporate America was unfair to all. It was not a good relationship.
He hated business.
Yeah,
but you kind of felt sometimes that a lot of the New York Times kind of hated businessmen.
I think that,
business people.
yeah, I think that might be fair, and I can tell you that the Times doesn't hate business, wants to be a hugely relevant player in business, and Ellen Pollack, editor of Business Week, is now the new BizDay editor. We're like lovers of business because you've written a lot about technology. Business is neither. Of course, business needs to be held to account, but the fact of the matter is that business is changing and technology is changing life as we know it. There could soon be driverless cars on the streets, in Manhattan, and AI, and what's happening with advanced manufacturing. Apple has a new device that is going to change the home, the way phones have changed, our own personal lives. I mean, and the stakes involved as these industries like cars and tech and TV and Facebook and Google collide and intersect. It's a great story. It's one of the best stories of our time, and we have to be there to be. And
getting overshadowed a bit by politics these days. We just can't help it.
And China, by the way, which may Kai-Fu Lee's one of the most. He ran Google and Microsoft in China, and he came and visited recently, and he's a very He invented speech recognition at Carnegie Mellon. He's one of the most noted technologists in the world. He thinks that China has a real advantage in the race for AI because the Chinese government is funding the
And they're
research.
doing about 20 times more research and development.
That's right.
In machine learning in China, because we're decimated, the research part of
Right.
the research and development. Andy, before we go to the audience, I'm going to send you a question, not from left field, but from the southern field, which is, tell us about Mississippi today, and why is that your incredible avocation, and about young journalists who have been sometimes underserved in places like Mississippi.
Mississippi Today is a digital first news organization in Mississippi, which is the poorest, unhealthiest, struggles with the worst school systems, is essentially in the bottom ranking of every single indicator of the quality of your life. It's the most racially polarized, politically, it's a very complicated place. I happen to have had a grandfather who was born and raised there in the Delta, so my roots go back.
Mayor of
He
Greenville.
was the mayor of Greenville, Mississippi. How many of you know Greenville, Mississippi? Hello. Talk to you later. If you actually saying this in this wonderful place, thinking of Roosevelt and Louis Brandeis, one of the distinguished members of the court during his era, said famously that he thought of the states as laboratories for democracy. Mississippi, if that's true, that the states are laboratories for democracy, Mississippi is crying out for an experiment. And Mississippi Today is that experiment. It is, the place has difficulty getting the level of information that you would hope that an electorate, that would allow and empower an electorate to make an informed judgment about the choices they're making as a state. So we got more reporters covering the State House. We got more reporters covering around the state now for politics. It's modeled after effectively what Politico is, for those of you who know Politico. It's a Politico for Mississippi on some level. Texas Tribune, if any of you know that, is a great, I recommend it as a great digital first news organization that's covering the state of Texas. And I think increasingly, to Walter's, inherent in Walter's comment is, for all of us in journalism, who have seen these great metropolitan dailies disappear, a lot of trouble in the states getting information that were previously easy to get through newspapers. Digital is going to replace that. There are some good TV stations around still, but the partnerships that are required to have an informed electorate, to have a democracy in these states, is a big challenge for journalism, and it's an exciting one for us in the South, in particular in Mississippi. So we got a lot of support from, we're nonprofits, we got a lot of support from foundations and such. But I think a lot of us in journalism, a lot of colleagues at the Times and here in New York and around the country are very concerned about getting local news. All news is local.
You know,
Right.
one of the things we
Getting
do
local
in
news
life,
great.
and I hope at the Crown Fellowship you'll learn it too, is okay, you've been successful, what are you doing to give it back and stuff? Being in Cleveland and Greenville and Greenwood, Mississippi with Andy Lack, because Kathy and I decided we got to go watch this because we've heard about it. We went around, and to watch you at the B.B. King Museum and then to watch you at Delta State
Yeah.
and watch you bring these young journalists together, it was just very inspiring.
Well,
So
you're
thank you
sweet
for
to
that.
say that. Thank you.
Let me open it up, if I may. Yes. Shout, and by the time you get halfway finished, I'll get you a microphone.
I'm just wondering about the echo chamber. Like, we in New York are, I mean, I guess we're left, and some of the, a little bit to the left, and journalists reflect that. And I consider MSNBC sort of just like Fox, but different sides. And when I watch Meet the Press this Sunday, 3 liberals, 1 conservative, and then Chuck Todd, who you could say is left. And New York Times, I assume that the person who said during the election that they needed to be against Trump, I assume those guys haven't changed. So what are you doing so that you don't make the same mistakes in coverage that you made before, and make sure you don't have an echo chamber of people validating your ideas and nobody challenging them?
I think that's a very, very important question, and we're having a lot of discussions about it. I would say that if you're a business person, you could rationally argue that the Trump administration has been a huge success. And there is like a bit of a sky is falling feeling in media, like, oh my God, another tweet, another disclosure, the Russia investigation, and it seems like, is there going to be an impeachment? And then you talk to someone in the business world, and they're like, thankfully, finally, is that someone is there to listen to us. They're removing regulations and you can kind of construct a completely different view. Now, it may not be one that many of you agree with, but there are a lot of people who feel that, which I think is inherent in your question, that the president has not represented them and their interests for a very long time. So we are trying in meetings to embrace the counterintuitive. We did a story at the Times about climate change and teachers wrestling with it, and actually, profiled, a teacher who wouldn't be typical in a sense in terms of like some doubters, and how that school, we're trying to be nuanced and surprising in our coverage instead of feeding into the narrative. But it is an ongoing challenge, and we have to do it, because being in the echo chamber is the way to lose the trust that is so important.
Let me ask Andy to do the echo chamber in two different ways. One, the echo chamber that we sort of asked about, which is we journalists get into an echo chamber and don't hear people outside. But also now the echo chamber, both in the blogosphere, on Twitter, or whatever, in which different people are just hearing news in a totally different way. People are getting into their own echo chambers.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an occupational hazard, the echo chamber. It does come with the territory. I'd push back on your question respectfully a bit as it relates to, say, Meet the Press and Chuck Todd, who's a very aggressive questioner of the newsmakers, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. I've noticed, and I won't bore you with a lot of the examples, but I've noticed that the tougher our questions get, the more, if they're questions about what the president is doing, for example, the more liberal we become in many of our viewers' opinions. That's an occupational hazard too. We're not in a popularity contest when it comes to questioning what the president's decisions are on any given day, or what he meant by what he said. And when we push hard on that, often that is uncomfortable for folks who are watching, and we get that. But we're not in partnership with the presidency. We have a role to play, as Rebecca mentioned, and it puts us in a position where we are often viewed through that filter of being biased, being too liberal. I did a forum during the campaign here in New York that many remember with Matt Lauer, in which we were accused by many of being way too tough on Hillary, that the questions were, first of all, many too many, and wildly aggressive and unreasonable. This was in September in the campaign. And our questioning of Trump, way too easy. You let him off the hook. He said something about Howard Stern 15 years ago, and you didn't call him out on it. What's wrong with you guys? Well, we were on live television. We had a lot of questions to ask, and we thought we'd take a pass on that one because it's been answered 10 times, and ask another question about Putin, for example, as it turned out. But that said, that was the filter that was being viewed. So your question, I agree with Rebecca, is absolutely fair. But we are dealing with this filter issue.
Sure.
And to the second part of your question, I think we have to work very aggressively to try to broaden the base, get people to see their filters, have you see us through as unfiltered a way as we can provide for you. That means working harder in every editorial meeting to get the balance that allows people to see it through whatever their filter is in a more reasonable way.
I might also add that in the digital world, these bubbles have become worse. The Journal did a feature called Red State, Blue State, where we compared, the coverage of just breaking news events on Facebook and the reaction and feed that you would get if you were a liberal versus a conservative, and they're completely different. And many of us exist in a world in which we are almost exclusively the people we agree with. The Times, I think James Bennett on the editorial page, he was the editor of The Atlantic, he's come, and he really wants to have a diverse array of opinions. It's no secret that the Times has a lot of liberal-leaning columnists, and we hired Bret Stephens from the Wall Street Journal. A complete, there was a huge outcry over that, and Bret is one of the most eloquent writers out there. He actually, wrote a lot of editorials against Trump. He never came around to Trump. He has some controversial views for liberals, and I think folks on both sides, the right and the left, need to say, you know, what this country needs is actually to begin to understand what the other side wants. And there seems to be, and we're seeing it on college campuses as well, like almost like nobody wants to hear it. You don't even, and so it's been, at the Times, we are going to keep trying to challenge our readers to say, actually, you need to be exposed to other views here, even if it's uncomfortable, because we need to begin to understand each other a little better.
And I will say that Twitter, in my opinion, and Facebook have exacerbated
Absolutely.
the issue.
I
Which
agree.
is now,
Yeah.
people on the left get the feeds from their friends and the stories.
That's
and
right.
likewise on the right. Yes. Esther, is that? Yeah, sorry. We're going to go to about 8:10. I know we're supposed
Okay,
to leave at
great.
8, but we've
So-
talked too long.
Another sort of filter that seems to be infecting the news left or right is simply the coverage is more about how this is going to play with the constituents, with Congress, rather than the actual implications of something. And I'm thinking specifically about health care, which if you cover it politically, which is what everybody does, you get what we've got. But if you were to cover it more in a business form, looking at healthcare spending versus perhaps investment in health, what are the actual implications, not simply of how much money we spend this year, but what about the money we're investing or not investing in people's health long term and preventive health? The same thing around education, infrastructure. We're covering all this in a very short term. This is going to play politically.
You know, that's a great question, which is why shouldn't you take over in Business Day and business sections the coverage of healthcare instead of making it a political coverage thing?
I think that, to be honest, business has not been as much a part of the discussion of these issues as it should be, and that's something I'm working a lot on. I do think that, follow the money is a favorite, adage of business reporters, and these tend to be the stories from the ground up, I think, that you're describing, of like, what is it like to choose a healthcare plan? What is it like to worry about, what's going to happen if a family member gets cancer, and what is it like to run a hospital and have to consider like how to possibly pay for people who have no insurance to receive care. I think that we do need to take it out of the political realm, which almost seems like a ping pong game, and begin, and we're trying to do that, but the challenge is there, and we need to probably, quite frankly, do a better job with that, because it does come down to real people. Even every day, like the new healthcare plan, what does it mean to people? Even if you're employed, and have a healthcare plan, it could change. So I take that as a challenge, and I think business and the effect on real people should be every much a part of the discussion as the inner beltway, which kind of becomes like a sporting game.
Right back in the back there, yeah, sorry. Go ahead. I'm going to get to this side in a second.
I was wondering if you could both comment on whether or not the media, or whether the media should be descriptive or prescriptive. And so I think part of what you said when you were talking about the coverage pre-election was getting it wrong. And if the reporting had indicated that Trump would win, would you be comfortable with what's happened since? Because I think that there might be a role that most media outlets have as a desire to inform. And editorially, you make that decision, whether it's the previous question or even the question before that. So what I'd like to understand is, how do you see the balance between being descriptive of what's going on in the country and being prescriptive, or serving that need to inform and to educate? And I think,
Andy,
it's an active choice that any editorial journalism outlet makes every day.
Yeah.
Well, it's a tough balance to get right. I mean, you framed a tough argument for us, and we have it every day in every editorial meeting I'm in. You know, are we reacting to something, or are we going to advance this story and try to get underneath it and bring more clarity or understanding of it? And we have lots of different programs and lots of different platforms on which, depending on where you're going, you'll find more descriptive or more prescriptive. On the broadcast platform, it's tough. We don't have the time, as much time as we'd like. Used to, but not so much anymore.
Tell me what an editorial meeting like today would be like. What do you do? I mean, what came up? What was the decision?
We
you
read
had
the
to
New York Times occasionally.
make?
And we say, did you see that story in the Washington Post? I'm so sorry. Have to give some. It's hurly-burly. I mean, it's a lot of people saying, I disagree with you. And it's a lot of people making a case for more time to do something that's more prescriptive than descriptive. We have a little different challenge on television than you do in print. I got 23 minutes. I'm not changing the nightly news because I think it should go more prescriptive. I can do a healthcare story and run it 2-3 times longer than I generally would, trying to get the day's news in 5, 6, 7 stories. And we do that. We make that choice when we think it's an important moment, and we can. It doesn't go as noticed, to your point, but as I'd like. On the digital platform, there's quite a lot of prescriptive, and arguably not enough. And we're, as the New York Times is, and the Post famously, particularly, a bunch of us we're hiring at a breakneck clip. Digital reporters and videographers. So.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that will solve the more prescriptive problem, the digital space.
Let me go in the way back there. I've been discriminating against the back. And,
I work for NBC.
Yeah.
no.
Who are you?
So I go back to the.
Well, actually, identify
Yes.
yourself and
Yeah.
Oh, Laura Del Greco and ad sales.
Good. Yeah.
Sorry? Mike.
Yeah.
Right, there we go. So my question is kind of going back to the concept of the Mississippi. So you talk about all of these little blogs, digital pockets, and then you talk about kind of the dearth of kind of a metro paper, right? But you have all of these little scattered pockets. Won't they need to burst up into some sort of cohesive whole? I mean, you've got Flipboard, you have all of these other kind of magazine conglomerates. But if I'm trying to find out something about Austin, Texas, I Google Austin, but then I get a lot of these other things. There's no one central place that I can get everything. So what I'm saying is, isn't there a future business model for some of these things that are starting to evolve and kind of pulling them up into the aggregate?
Let me ask Andy to use that good question as a platform to talk about some of the things you're doing with Axios and Snap, and
Yeah.
NBC is looking at different platforms.
Yeah, so we're investing in those opportunities that I think you're suggesting. We're working hard. Let's talk about Snapchat, which actually is a more attractive, in some ways, conversation because it's the new kid on the block, and it's growing dramatically. And they're very interested in video, as you probably have heard Evan Spiegel describe Snapchat as a camera company. So we're creating a news program for them. What does that mean in terms of a Snapchat environment? It ain't the NBC Nightly News, it ain't the Today Show, what is it? And we're working on it. So we got a team pounding away at it. It's gonna roll out in June. And each of these efforts go to the different kinds of opportunities you're talking about. What can we do to change the game, to encourage some of what you're describing, whether it's what you'd find in Mississippi Today or you'd find in a digital world on blogs? How does Snapchat want to treat having a relationship with their audience in a news context? That's a question they'd never asked before. They're not that old, but they're asking it of us, and I'm sure some others. Facebook isn't really asking us that question. Google really never asked us that question. I'm hopeful that Axios is asking that question journalistically in more traditional ways. They're asking it on digital, but they're creating newsletters that are faster and as smart as you possibly can get on your smartphone or any device you're using, portable or desktop, that will inform you about everything they think is going on in the world, but particularly in Washington on any given day. Times has got a version of that too. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
And I might just add that this is, there's a term in the news business now, local news deserts. There's many of them. I looked at the employment in journalism, it's down 35% since 2008. And local news deserts are where kind of the fake news and some of these stories can really take.
I got to add one thing before Walter goes to the couple of last questions, but this really, I hope, and Esther and others, NBC and the Times is doing it in their own way, but we've put $500 million into Snapchat, another half into BuzzFeed. We're sitting at those tables trying to understand what role we can play to advance information and news gathering in the country on those platforms, specifically with these new organizations that are 4 or 5 years ago, none of us were talking about BuzzFeed or Snapchat. And here we are today with billions of dollars going into these companies and investing in them the way some of us in traditional media can will help us focus on how we continue to try to evolve.
And the
in
way
those
back
platforms.
there, I'm sorry, we've got so many questions. Last row, I think, yeah, because you've already stood up.
Hi there. Yeah. I wanted to call back actually to one of your earlier discussions about the challenges of sort of Facebook and Twitter kind of infringing upon revenue models. How, if at all, are you guys approaching sort of pay for content or pay what you wish, pay what you can models? And how, if at all, are you actually approaching the sort of millennial generation like myself who have honestly grown up in a situation where we've never really had to pay for media. We've never had to pay for stories. We've never had to pay for a paper. And to ask us to pay is, completely weird.
So Rebecca, two
how
things there.
do you convince us? How do you get us engaged?
People younger than the millennials to pay, but also getting away from just subscriptions so that there can be sort of a paper drink or a paper article or other type of models.
No, I mean, it's a great question, and we have to get, and what you're doing with Snap is really important. The Times recently went on it. The Snap is not a pay model. The Times is experimenting with all kinds of ways to get our content in the hands of young people who will hopefully ultimately become subscribers at some point. There's also a huge initiative actually to pay for subscriptions for students and in colleges to get people kind of in the habit of reading. But there's no question whether it's digital platforms, there's a whole service journalism project that we're starting at the Times. Young people, it turns out, you all love credit cards and are much more financially savvy than one might think. I have 3 kids, and I learn a lot from watching them, and it's very humbling. But I would also say that it's a misnomer to think that young people don't care about current events. The things that my son comes in, he came into my room at 7 o'clock this morning, and he said, "Mom, Uber, can you believe it? They didn't pick anyone up in London." And I said, "Well, Eli, that's not really true," but yet he is seeing things every day, and the Times absolutely needs to get in there in a way, and in ways that we probably, and we're hiring, by the way, a lot of young people to help because they are the professionals at it, versus someone like me who spent a lot of years in a newsroom. So I would say all of the above.
Anything else to add to that, Andy?
No, we're covered.
Okay. I think there's so many more questions. I hate to do it, but it is 8:10. Come on up, say hello if you want, get your last question in. But let's thank Rebecca and Andy. And Laura. Laurie, yeah.